Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis with Forbes Breaking News. Joining me now is Senior Fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies and retired Rear Admiral Mark Montgomery. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me, Brittany.
A really important conversation today. Last week, reports indicated that Israel and Hamas were getting close to a deal that would include a temporary ceasefire in exchange for the release of hostages. And right before our conversation began today, Qatar reportedly said that Hamas has had a positive reaction to a proposed negotiation. First, I want your reaction. What do you make of all of this?
Well, look, I think we're at the point now where both sides see a value in a break. I think the Israelis realize at this point that the remaining 130 or so hostages are probably not going to be released through combat. And I think they're now reporting up to 30 hostages are known to have been killed during operations over the last few months. So I think they're at that point where if one of their two primary goals was to recover and release the hostages that Hamas took on October 7th, if that was one of their top two goals, they really need to get that, and this is the only way to do it. From Hamas's point of view, their battalions are taking a beating. The Israelis have probably destroyed 50% of the real combat power of Hamas, maybe slightly more. They've killed more than 50% of the senior leadership, and they're beginning to occupy and demilitarize a significant amount of the tunneling work. So from that point of view, things are not going well for Hamas. And a break at this point might give them a chance to, reposition themselves and figure out another way out of this problem. So at this point, both sides, have some skin in the game, have some desire to get to a solution. So it's no surprise that Qatar, Egypt, and the United States, and potentially the Saudis collectively, have been able to influence both sides to come to this ceasefire arrangement that I think is still not a guarantee, but could be 24, 48 hours away.
To your point, we're not there yet, but it does seem like it's moving in an optimistic direction. If they reach an agreement, do you think we could sort of expect the beginning of the end of the war here?
So, look, I think the Israelis had three major goals in this war. They had two major goals: defeat Hamas militarily and free their hostages. I think to defeat Hamas militarily, they saw that they needed to do three lines of effort. One was probably destroy 70% of the 15,000 legitimate Hamas warfighters. I know people sometimes said Hamas had 20, 25,000, but 5 or 10,000 of those people were kind of like weekend warriors, like not really that committed. So they needed to kill 70% of that fighting force. They also needed to kill all the leadership. And in their mind, that does mean all the leadership. They have a deck of cards, and they, with the face of those people, and they plan on getting all of them. And then finally, they need to destroy the infrastructure, really the tunneling systems, 300 to 400 miles worth of tunnels that are jaw-droppingly complex. I mean, it's not just that they're up to 70 meters deep, which is deeper than New York subways. It's that some of them are wide enough for a car to drive through, and in fact, cars did drive through some of the tunnels. These were not tunnels where people were like hovering away from bombs topside. They had medical facilities, sleeping facilities, planning facilities, stowage of weapons. So the Israelis needed to get rid of all three levels of this: the people, the warfighters, the leaders, and the infrastructure. I don't think they're going to be done until that's done. Now, the degree to which they have to keep fighting after the ceasefire will probably be trying to kill the leaders. And that might be something they can do without reinitiating ground ops. It can be done with drones, aircraft, intelligence, things like that. And they don't have to kill them all right away. If you remember going back to the Munich massacre when they swore vengeance on everyone involved in that, it took them more than a decade to complete that. I don't think that that's what they're looking at here, but they're serious about this. And so I don't think the war is over till all three of those things are over, but it might be that the ground war is coming to an end.
Let's talk about the United States' involvement here. As we know, Secretary of State Antony Blinken is on a trip to the Middle East right now, and he reportedly said this: "There's still a lot of work to be done, but we continue to believe that an agreement is possible and indeed essential." What do you make of the U.S. response here?
Well, first, I would step back and say the United States has been the steadfast supporter of Israel in this. And it starts with President Biden. I mean, we can have questions about how we got here, how we've not done a good job deterring Iran over the last few years. But the reality is, once October 7th happened, Israel's had no greater friend. And I think sometimes over the judgment of his cabinet and his senior leaders, he has said no. We're going to provide the support. So from the United States point of view, that's been a lot of munitions. We have flown, I think 200 plus C-17s. Those are our large cargo planes worth of munitions into Israel to drop off all kinds of munitions, whether it's 155 for their howitzers or more likely, 500, 1,000, 2,000 bombs for their planes, but also supporting systems that help all that. So the United States has absolutely been by Israel's side. We've defended them in the United Nations. We have not bent to the international push, to cease operations before Hamas was destroyed. So from that point of view, the president has been the absolute strongest defender. Now, look, we're now at the point, though, where the president, this is obviously bad politics for the president. So I think, that's why you see Blinken out there pushing very hard for this ceasefire now to try to get this out of, daily kinetic operations and into a prisoner exchange for hostages and then, a much slower drumbeat of like air operations and drone operations by the Israelis.
We've seen tensions rising in the Middle East ever since October 7th. We've seen the Houthis attacking shipping in the Red Sea, Hezbollah firing rockets into northern Israel, as well as obviously the fighting in Gaza. Let's say there is a negotiation that works, that there's a ceasefire there. What can we expect in terms of tensions in the Middle East in the wider region?
It's going to be interesting. First, I'll tell you, Hezbollah would be the second happiest group if there was a ceasefire. They have not wanted this war. I don't think they were ready for it. I don't think they're in a good position. Look, it would be tough for Israel to fight Hezbollah. I don't think they want a Northern Front war. But if Hezbollah was going to join this war, they'd have joined October 8th. The fact that they didn't tells you that their leader Nasrallah is not looking for this war, and the Iranians haven't forced him to step into it, because he's very much dependent on Iran, much more so than even Hamas. So my take is that Hezbollah would take that as a win, and that would probably lead to a ceasefire and the exchange. There's kind of this low-level exchange going on, but it's very metered, between the Israelis in the north and Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. It's like only 5 kilometers in, generally against towns they know to be evacuated. Very few people getting killed on either side. My point is, I think that would immediately cool down. The Houthis is a tougher problem. The Houthis have always been kind of a wild card. They were doing some of these bad behavior before October 7th. And we missed a real opportunity. This is where I say, like, sometimes we're not good at deterrent operations. They really started attacking our shipping around October 17th. We should have done heavy strikes against them by Halloween. 2 weeks of that should have been enough. Maybe by Thanksgiving. Not waiting until until I think January 10th or so to really start striking back at them. So I don't know what it's going to take to get the Houthis back in the box, so to speak. They went on a 5-year kind of slow, low-level war with the Saudis, with ballistic missile exchanges against Saudi air attack, responded to by Saudi air attacks. So they can fight for a long time. So that one may not get back in the box quickly.
Qatar, as we know, was involved in previous negotiations that called for a temporary ceasefire in exchange for some hostages. I am curious what you make of Qatar's current role as mediator now.
So they're the best mediator. I think they're a better mediator than Egypt. They have better ties to the Hamas leadership, who the very, very senior Hamas political leadership are living in Qatar. I think the Four Seasons. I mean, I'm being a little facetious, but they're living well in Qatar. And so I think Qatar's in a good position. Qatar's an unusual country. They certainly are frustrating, but they also host a major U.S. base. So, they definitely know how to play both sides of the coin here. But I think I do think there comes a point when a ceasefire is the right thing. If they're ever going to get hostages back, this ceasefire probably has to happen in the next, week or 2 weeks, and hopefully the next few days. And so from that point of view, I think Qatar's, doing a good job, and they also are the only ones that really have a right on the voice of the Qatari, of the Hamas leadership there. I will say the Egyptians probably have a better, through the Sinai, have a better feel of of Hamas's military leadership's intent right now. So you probably need both of them to get a good deal.
When you're looking at a potential ceasefire, when you're looking at the tensions in the Middle East region right now, is there anything that you're seeing that you believe is missing from the international conversation?
Well, I think the biggest thing that's missing is, the eventual need to rebuild Gaza. I don't think the Israelis intend to do it. I don't think the United States taxpayer would get too excited about that bill. I mean, we're already looking at the Ukraine bill and wondering, how Europe's going to pay for that and what our contribution might be. And certainly, there's a broader question of the day after. What kind of political leadership do you have in Gaza, and then what kind of security arrangement do you have? Because while I think it's very suboptimal for the Israelis to be doing the security, and I don't think most Israelis would not want to do that. It's completely unacceptable to have some form of armed Palestinian force. I don't think Israel can accept that, because if that's the case, they can never move back into their kibbutzes and their towns in the south that they've evacuated. So that day after, and then the rebuilding are kind of the two big issues. We don't want to say them right now because we want to get the ceasefire in place. But after that, you then kind of have to say what's next, because you have nearly a million people in refugee camps.
Of course, and obviously, as we sit here right now, there is no ceasefire in place. But once there is there any indication of what that day after does look like?
So, I think when I think about the security arrangements, it's going to eventually have to be some kind of international force. I hate to say the United Nations, because the United Nations has been responsible for the implementation of what's called a Security Resolution 1701 in the north of Lebanon, and it's been a complete failure. They were supposed to put the Lebanese north, the Hezbollah north of the Litani River. They've never moved them. In other words, they haven't been able to achieve even their most basic steps. So I'm not sure anyone would trust a UN-mandated security force to do its basic steps for security in Palestine, and that would get you right back in Gaza, and that would get you right back into combat again. So you really need some kind of coalition of the willing, and I'm confident the United States is not part of that coalition. We can do logistics support for it. We can help with some of the command and control and some of the resourcing, but we are not going to be the boots on the ground in that. So you've got to find out who's willing to do that, and that's a very small list of countries.
As we sit here right now, obviously all eyes are on a potential deal, a potential negotiation, but what else are you looking out for next? What else should the United States specifically be looking out for next?
Well, the United States has a ongoing problem with Iran right alongside this. So if you look at Iran as kind of the mastermind of a lot of this, and I get they may not have given the exact go order on October 7th, but they trained, resourced, supported the Hamas warfighters. They're completely the trainer, resourcer, and supplier of Hezbollah, another 8 or 9 Iranian Shia proxy groups in Syria and Iraq, and the Houthis. They are the adversary in the Middle East. And just because we've wrapped up, just because a ceasefire comes into play, we'll assume that happens. That doesn't mean our challenge with Iran is complete. And in fact, as you asked about earlier, we still have the problem with the Houthis, who the Iranians are supplying with cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, and drones that are being fired at international shipping and at U.S. warships. And I'd note that earlier this week, the USS Gravely, one of our Arleigh Burke class destroyers, had to use its last-minute, point defense system, destroying an inbound cruise missile less than a mile away. First time we've had those on board our ships for 40 years on hundreds of ships, and we've never had to use that system for a close-in defense of a U.S. warship against a missile. And it's quite an event that it had to happen, and that means that the Iranians are selling more and more equipment to the Houthis. So from my perspective, even with Gaza, I wouldn't say stabilized, but in a ceasefire, we still have a significant issue with the Houthis that we have to resolve. And really, our issues with the Iranians and deterring them from supporting or imposing our will on them so they stopped supporting the Houthis with supplies.
After this, what do you think the United States' relationship with Iran looks like? Because I've had the privilege of talking to your colleagues at the FDD, and they all have said Iran is behind this. These are all connected, and Iran is to blame here.
So I think the right question is, at the end of this, what's our relationship with Saudi Arabia, and what's Israel's relationship with Saudi Arabia? The October 7th timing, and the reason a lot of us think Iran probably had something to do with it, was it was perfect for Iran. It was clear there'd been some interviews where it was very clear that Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, the effective leader of Saudi Arabia, and Prime Minister Netanyahu were both very, very close to Israeli-Saudi normalization. And this war has obviously stopped that. The United States and Saudi Arabia were reconciling, getting closer and closer after the very bad relations at the beginning of the Biden administration. Both those paths were blocked by this. So I think the most important thing that happens after in diplomacy is first that the U.S.-Saudi relationship becomes fully reconciled, and Israeli-Saudi normalization occurs. And what that'll do is that's a strong signal to Iran that we are all in this together. The Israelis, the Gulf states, including Saudi Arabia, and the United States are on one side, and you are on the other. And I think that'll go a long way to cooling things down, because Saudi Arabia is trying to drive a knife through those relationships.
Retired Rear Admiral Mark Montgomery, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate your insights. And as the situation develops, I hope you join me again soon.
Thank you very much. It was a real pleasure.